So we're going to talk about now building growth on a solid foundation. So this is the framework that I like to use, and that ultimately I like to do it as a pyramid because it's essentially a lot of people have seen companies that grow very fast and then fail. And ultimately to grow effectively, it needs to be on a strong foundation. And if you can build on a strong foundation, that growth will last and be sustainable. And so that's why I've represented it with a pyramid. And at the foundation of that pyramid is what we call in the startup world product market fit. But the whole idea there is that your product needs to be a must-have for the people who ultimately become the customers. So if they think it's a nice to have or it's not important, the best tactics in the world, the best process isn't going to matter, because ultimately when they try the product, they're not going to like it, they're not going to come back, and then you can't grow. So at the foundation, a product that people love is really important. And I'll talk about sometimes just with a little bit of positioning, you can take a product that right now people don't necessarily love and make it something that they do love. So I'm going to talk in this section quite a bit about product market fit. Then once you have product market fit, the next section is about this level 2 is about now you're ready to grow. And so you have to identify what the metric that really matters for growing. So what does growth mean? Is it just more people? Is it more dollars? Is it something else? So you have to define what is it that you're trying to grow. And then also the tracking system. So how do you actually measure what you need to measure? How do you run tests? So the different tools, essentially the systems you need in place to be able to what we call instrument for growth. So essentially the instrumentation. Once you have those, now you're ready to grow. You've defined what growth is. That's what this level 3 is. So that's where you have the team, how the team works together. And I'll go in a lot of details all day on these, so don't worry, this is supposed to be brief. So this is the growth team, and the growth team, how they work together to learn and execute a process and ultimately organize all of those learnings so that they understand what works for growing the business. And so that's what this level 3 is. And then once you have a team working correctly, how do you get that team plugged in with the rest of the company so that they can really execute growth in a way that it's not just the marketing stuff, but it's all of the opportunities for growth? And how do you get permission to really run tests in all the places that can accelerate growth? And that's really hard. Anyone who's in a bigger company is going to know that that's a pretty hard thing to be able to decide, okay, I want to test this different way of having someone sign up for the product, or having someone recommend the product inside the product to other people, or even just some way of working together collaboratively in a product. Getting a product team and an engineering team and others working together, that's hard. So that's really what we talk about in level 4. And then level 5, these are the fastest growing companies. These are the Facebooks, Airbnb, Uber, where really everyone in the company, they're working together to drive growth, and that this is what we should all aspire to. And especially when you can do it at scale, when you have thousands and thousands of employees who are all working on that same success metric and able to drive growth together. So we'll talk about that last, but we're going to work our way up. So again, product market fit, I've touched on it. It means that it's a must-have product for a big enough market to be able to drive growth. And there's a couple of ways you can measure that. So traditionally, what people like to talk about is if someone starts using their product and they keep using your product, that's the best sign that it's actually valuable for them. But the problem with that is that you could wait for months or years to know if they're going to keep using it. So I found a way to be able to predict up front when someone just in their first week with your product to figure out if they're going to keep using your product. And that's this question that I have here under leading indicator. So really, retention is a lagging indicator. If people keep using it, it's because they love it, but it takes a long time to see that. But the leading indicator is just asking people, how would you feel if you could no longer use this product? And if they say, I would be somewhat disappointed, a lot of entrepreneurs see that answer and they get really excited. Ooh, they would be somewhat disappointed. But in my mind, that's almost the same as saying I wouldn't be disappointed. It's just like it's pretty good. It's a nice to have, and that's not enough. For some, there's so many choices out there. So I'm really only focused on people who say I would be very disappointed without the product. And when I find people who would be very disappointed without the product, they're the ones who consider it a must-have. They'll come back and keep using it. So I'll give you one example. I asked this question to a new startup, to the users on a new startup, and I'll take a step back. What I normally see is the companies that can grow long-term, they're at least 40% of their users. So almost half the users who sign up, try it, use it for a little while, say, I would be very disappointed without this product. But I went into one company and I committed to work for them for 6 months, and I asked that question, and only 7% of the users said they would be very disappointed without the product. But I already made the commitment for 6 months, so a little bit scary. But what we were able to actually move that 7% to 40% in 2 weeks. And so what we did was we just studied the answers from the people who said, I would be very disappointed, and we asked them, what is the benefit you get from this product? And we learned more about those people, how they were using the product, and then we changed the positioning, so just said, the product will do this for you. And the challenge with these guys is that they had many ways to use the product, and so it was in the security space, so there was a lot of different security apps tied together, but it was really one of those apps that people were really passionate about. And so we highlighted the benefit of that app. When they signed up, we quickly brought them in to use the app that way, and then we asked the next group of people who signed up, and it was 40% when we made that change. And so we didn't have to change the product. We just had to change how we introduced the product. And then 6 months later, continuing to iterate on the feedback, we got it to 60%. And today, that's a multi-billion-dollar company, but one that I almost said, oh, this will fail. It doesn't have enough must-have users. So it's not the end of the world if it's low, but you have to get it higher in order to grow the business sustainably. So that's just one way to do it. You had a question?
Yeah, I'm starting from scratch.
Okay.
I don't have any users. Should I care about this question right now, or I could implement a process to ask for each user entering my platform?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I'm going to repeat it for the camera in case people can't hear it there. So when you're just starting the business, if somebody, do you ask this question right at the beginning? And what I would recommend is initially the question you want to ask is you want to validate the problem that you think you're solving. Why would someone even need the product? So you have your hypothesis and talk to some customers, get feedback to make sure that the problem you're solving is an important one. Once you have enough people who've signed up, so you're not trying to grow the business in the beginning, you're just trying to get some people onto the product to get feedback. Once you have enough people on the product, so even if it's like 100 people using the product, then you can start to ask this question. And really this question is going to tell you two things. Either I want to keep just trying to fix the product and trying to make the minimum product a little bit bigger, or make it a little bit better, or I actually have a product that people now say is a must-have, in which case one is very patient, the other is very aggressive. Now I have to climb that pyramid as fast as I can. So if you're just starting, build your initial MVP. Really good book would be Lean Startup. I'm sure if you're here, you've probably heard of some of those books, but Lean Startup, 4 Steps to the Epiphany, but do your customer development, and really your big question is, I've talked in a lot of the businesses, it's like in a car, when do I step on the accelerator and really try to grow that business? The one caution I'll give you is that a study was done on startups, big study was done on startups, and the number one cause of startup failure going out of business is stepping on that accelerator too early. So if they try to grow before the product has product market fit, before it's a must-have, then you waste a lot of money and you die. So it's a little bit scary, or very scary. But that's where this question helps you not just look at the data, but to actually try to understand what's happening more than just, am I having a good day today? Oh, everything looks good. I'm having a bad day. Everything looks bad. But it takes the emotion out of it and gives you more of a benchmark to decide to accelerate. So let's go to the next slide. So really, in the big picture of what you're trying to do, and this is the piece that I think a lot of us forget about when we're executing a process and just doing a lot of the tactics. In the big picture of what you're really trying to do is you've created this value, which is must-have, and you're trying to leverage that value as much as possible. And the more that you highlight what truly matters about that product, get as many people to come in and experience the product in the right way. You have people who use the product, keep using the product, tell their friends about it, and that's how you drive sustainable growth. So product market fit is at the foundation of any fast-growing, sustainably growing company. So it's really important to constantly understand and leverage your product market fit when you're driving growth. So once you have that product market fit, then now you say, okay, I've validated it. I can start to prepare for actually driving growth, and that's this level 2. And again, that's when you want to actually put in your measurement systems. It's when you want to figure out what your key success metric is. If you say I have 5 key success metrics, what happens if 3 go up and 2 go down? It's really hard to know if you're being successful. So you have to find your one most important metric. In the whole next section, we're going to talk a lot in detail on that. Because if you have the wrong metric, it can be a problem. But the right metric is really powerful. And so we call that a North Star metric. And then all of the instrumentation. So essentially, how do you measure what's happening? How do you test to improve it? There's a lot of tools that you need, or at least you have to build your product or your site in such a way that you can run that testing and do that tracking. So the instrumentation, I like to break it down into kind of 3 key areas. The first is tools to understand. So you want to make sure that you understand what's happening. So first thing you want to understand is, are people actually using the product? So that's part of the tracking. Another thing you want to understand is, why are they using the product, or why are they not using it? So that's the qualitative side. So quantitative and qualitative are both really important for the understanding. And so sometimes that's metrics. So what I tend to find is people are really good on metrics, or really good on kind of the softer side of intuition and understanding. But the power comes when you bring those together. So surveys, usability studies, conversations with people, plus the hard data that says, how did they discover the product? What did they do first? What do they keep doing when they come back? What's the difference between people who use the product long-term versus people who only try it once and leave? So the more you understand, the more that you can work to improve the situation. So tools to improve would be things like A/B testing, so Google Optimize. That's great for pages, but inside a product, you might need something where you can feature flag, and if we have this feature, what happens long-term? If we don't show this feature, what happens long-term? And so there's some kind of feature flagging type products where you can test, and it's not always a pure A/B test, but what you ultimately want to do is make changes and be able to see what happens with those changes. And when we get into a later section, we'll talk about, you want to have a hypothesis when you make those changes. How do you decide which changes to test? There's a whole big process to that, but ultimately it requires some tooling to do that effectively. Email is another place where you want to run that testing. You can do some testing even in advertisements. There's just lots of different areas to do testing, but it generally requires some kind of putting instrumentation in place. Oh, and then ultimately you want to, over time, take all of that information and aggregate it so that you get smarter as a group. So then the growth team and the growth process is, now I've got a product that people love, at least the right people. So not, you've found your right segment of people who consider the product a must-have. And I have my success metric, and I have my tooling to do testing and tracking and understanding. Now I need to put in a process and have a team that has this process, and this will be a lot of what we talk about today, so I'm not going to go a ton into this. But let's go to the next slide. And but really, when you break it down, it's process and team are a big part of this section. And so when I like to think about the team, there's a lot of ways that you can organize the team, and it's not there's not like one perfect way, but ultimately, who are the people who I need to bring together to be able to run tests and run that learning each week? And so when we get into the process section, we'll talk about that's a big part. If every time I come up with an idea and we decide we're going to test that idea, we can never get a designer to run that idea, then part of my team probably needs to be a dedicated designer. Maybe the same thing for an analyst, maybe the same thing for an engineer, maybe the same thing for a marketing copywriter. But so don't look at this team as being the exact perfect team. Really, it's the team that you need to run testing, run good testing, and keep running more testing. And so these are examples of the types of roles. So a growth master is really someone who's bringing the whole team together and managing the process and making sure that that rhythm of testing is happening week to week. Marketers, a lot of times they're going to be testing out in the channels, maybe some of the copy, maybe the email marketing, content marketing, but just that skill of marketing. Analysts, they're going to be people who are understanding, first of all, what's happening overall in the business, but can also analyze specific tests and can figure out opportunities where you could be testing. So again, we could feel free as we go forward to ask more questions about any one of these roles. But designers and engineers I talked about. Again, some teams it works great when you just borrow that and they're not a core part of the growth team. Other teams, you waste too much energy trying to borrow the resources, and so you're going to want to have those dedicated. But ultimately, it's this team that's working together to execute a growth process. And that process is actually not, sometimes people say, I invented the growth process, or Brian Balfour invented the growth process. There's different people who kind of have that association. The truth is, it's really just the scientific process. So, it's been around for hundreds of years, and it's essentially having an understanding of what's happening or a hypothesis of what's happening, and then running tests to improve that hypothesis. But ideally, what you want to do is generate lots of ideas for how you might be able to improve it, have a way to prioritize which ideas you want to test, and then run the tests, analyze the results, and keep doing that. And hopefully that it's not just randomly testing all over, but you've had an analyst who said, this is where we think the best opportunity for growth in the business is right now. Let's really try to learn about this area. Let's take some focus. Now we'll put it on this area. And that you're kind of getting smarter and smarter through this scientific process about how you accelerate growth in the business. So again, we're going to go through this in a lot more detail. But the whole goal of all of this is to create that loop that leads to learning. So even when something doesn't work, you learn from it. And so you learn as much from what doesn't work as you do from what does work. So a lot of times people talk about every test we run is a failed test. Not really. Like, those failed tests are learning to where you're essentially saying, okay, we're going to test in this area now because we understand that we actually did it pretty well in this area. And so, but when something actually does work, that's where you want to do more of that. And so systematize it. Figure out how do we act on that learning in a regular way? How do we automate it? Whether that's we need to put a team that's constantly, Google works great for us. We need to put a team on Google, or email works great for us. We need to have a team on email. And then what are the systems that we can put in place to automate that and really make the most of that? But ultimately, and then that learning often feeds new ideas and helps you prioritize which ideas you're going to run the next week. So that's that's the whole idea here, is that this is feeding that learning process. And that ultimately, the more testing you do, the more learning you do. And so that really, if there's like the simplest formula for growth that I could come up with, it's test more, grow more. You know, the more tests you do, the more that you're going to actually learn what works and what doesn't work. And so it's really important to set a target around how much testing you're trying to do each week. If you say we're gonna run one great test a month, how do you know it's a great test until you run it? So it's better to run 4 or 5 tests. I mean, it depends on the business. Not every business you can run a lot of tests, but this example on the right is actually a pretty interesting one. It's from Twitter in their early days. You can see it's from 2010. So right when Twitter got going, they actually hit a point where they almost stopped growing. And you know, maybe they thought, okay, well, we reached the full market for Twitter, but obviously they didn't, because they grew many times more after that. But a new head of product came in, so not a head of marketing, but a new head of product came in and said, how many tests are we running per week? And he realized they were actually only running like 1 or 2 tests per month at Twitter, despite 40 million users going through the system. And so he didn't say, we need to fix this, all he did was he said, we need to run more tests, and we need to try to run at least 10 tests per week. And when I heard him present this, he presented it at something called the Agile Marketing Meetup. When I heard him present that, he didn't present the data of what happened, but you actually, it's public data on the growth rates of businesses. They report them, you know, there's a lot of external reporting that's out there. And so I just mapped when they did that against the growth rates of the business, and you can see as soon as they cranked that testing velocity up, they accelerated growth quite a bit. So that's where I think the very simplest way to start growing your business is to run more tests. Obviously, running more of the right tests in the right areas, smart tests implemented in the right way is going to make an even bigger difference, and we'll talk a lot about that. But ultimately, and this is where I touched on the team, that if you're not able to get tests out at the velocity that you wanted, trying to figure out why. Why couldn't we launch that test? Oh, well, we didn't have access to an engineer, or there's a big product launch that was happening that took all the people away, or we didn't have budget for it, or whatever that might be. Trying to address the issues that prevent the testing is a big part then of being able to accelerate growth in the business. So we'll talk more about that. You're going to see that graph come up again and again, because I really want to remind you, I think that's a super important concept here. And on the level 4, it's about aligning the different groups to work together. So again, historically, teams thought of growth as being something that either the marketing team or the sales team did, depending on the business, or maybe both of them. But the truth is that the best, fastest growing companies, the product team's working in there, the support team, the engineers are supporting those efforts. So you want to align the team to work together to understand how growth works and get them working together. So that's that level 5 or level 4. And what you want to understand there, a lot of times people will just set goals on growth. They'll say, we want to be twice as big next year. But that doesn't really help you that much, right? How are you going to be twice as big is more of a function of what you do. And so it becomes important to monitor not just the result, but what's leading to the result. So that's the input side. I'm going to come back to this again, is that it's really you manage the inputs, and the output, the result, is a function of doing well with the inputs that drive the results. So that's really what you're looking at here, is taking a couple of key objectives and saying how many ideas, how many tests, what are we doing against those ideas, and if we're not doing anything, we can't expect the result to happen. So being able to actually get a visualization of all of that becomes important. And then the final part of a fast-growing company is this company-wide growth culture, and that's where you're getting everyone in the business to work together to effectively drive growth, and not just giving permission to run tests at this point in the product, but actually having that enthusiastic participation from people on the team. So they're coming up with ideas. They're thinking, gosh, there's a better way to do this. I used TransferWise today for the first time, and I know they're really good with growth, but I had trouble doing something. So like you could look at that as a negative, but I know the head of growth over there pretty well, and I quickly sent an email to him saying, hey, just wanted to let you know I struggled with this part inside the product. There may be an opportunity for some testing there. And so I can't tell him the answer of how to fix it, but I can tell him an opportunity of what might be less than perfect, and it's a good place to focus on some potential solutions to improve it. And so when you get everyone in your company eyeing and looking for any opportunity for improvement, that's a pretty powerful process. And then the growth team is really then taking all of those ideas and deciding which ones are going to be tested week to week, and we'll talk about that. So both of my kids do rowing, and I think it's just such a good analogy to how a well-functioning company works. It's just there's power in getting everyone to work together. And so ultimately, this North Star metrics, this key growth metric, is what defines success. And having everyone in the company understand that metric and work together to grow that metric is the end goal of what we're trying to do today. So again, I have team discussion there. So if you're by yourself, discuss it with yourself. But a couple of key questions. So one, trying to figure out where are you on that pyramid. So that pyramid, are you still like you at the foundation of the pyramid? That's pretty easy. Not easy, but it's easy to know where you are. And then, but some companies, rarely are you just at level 3 only. Yeah, sometimes it's I got to improve my instrumentation. I have to improve here and I have to improve here, but I would work from the bottom up. I wouldn't say we got to get the team all working together when you don't have the instrumentation right. Get the tracking, testing, and everything else working, then start to add other pieces. So what is the lowest part on the pyramid where you need to focus a lot of energy right now is an important question. And then are there any tracking, we might want to go back one, yeah. Are there any holes in your tracking or reporting is another important question for that level 2. So I'll give you like 2 or 3 minutes just to think through that, since we don't have teams to discuss it as much, but take a couple minutes to think through that.